Good afternoon. On behalf of Kairos Ireland, I welcome people wherever you are to this afternoon's webinar, which is Israel and Apartheid Society. Our speaker is Brian Brown, Methodist minister and a veteran of the struggle against apartheid in South Africa. This is the second webinar hosted by Kairos Ireland. Our first webinar was addressed by the Palestinian theologian Munther Isaac, and at his ordination as a Lutheran pastor, he was given a Franciscan prayer, and I'm going to read it. May God bless you with holy anger at injustice, oppression, and exploitation of people, so that you may tirelessly work for justice and peace among all people. May God bless you with the gift of tears to shed with those who suffer from pain, rejection, starvation, or the loss of all that they cherish, so that you may reach out your hand to comfort them and transform their pain into joy. May God bless you with enough foolishness to believe that you really can make a difference in this world, so that you are able, with God's grace, to do what others claim cannot be done. This prayer could be a description of Brian's prophetic ministry. I used to think that prophets were wild, craggy men shouting down from mountaintops. But having met Brian, I now know that prophets can be courteous, polite, urbane individuals, but no less angry about injustice or compassionate with victims or determined to effect change, even when the odds seem insuperable. Brian was the administrative director of the Anti-Apartheid Christian Institute based in Johannesburg. In October of 1977, the special branch raided the offices of the Christian Institute. They began in Cape Town with a dawn raid, but that gave an opportunity for a telephone call to be made to Brian's wife, Marion, giving warning that Joburg was likely to be next. Before he went to the office, Brian packed his briefcase with various items, chocolate cake recipes, children's storybooks, and the ramblings of a religious crank on the role of Melchizedek in God's purposes. He then took great pleasure as a bemused special branch colonel read through this material, looking for incriminating evidence. Being banned severely restricted a person's freedom to work and function. A car full of special branch officers were parked outside the front door, and just by coincidence, Brian's neighbour also happened to be a special branch officer. He was posted to the Denbighdale and Clayton West Circuit in West Yorkshire by the British Methodist Church. Now, culture shock can be really devastating, and translating from Johannesburg to Denbighdale is a challenge of climate, dialect, and attitudes, not only for Brian and Marion, but also their 3 children. But they made the grade. At the farewell event, when Brian moved on to another position, the church steward said of him, "There's not much wrong with him." A friend whispered in Brian's ear, "Harry doesn't normally give compliments like that." Brian continued to challenge South African apartheid through ecumenical agencies such as the British Council of Churches. As a disciple of Jesus, he stood for kingdom values, justice, love, and truth. The security police files, when they were opened, stated that he had been the greatest danger within the international church community to the apartheid state. B'Tselem and Human Rights Watch have stated that they are not qualified to compare apartheid in Israel with that which was formerly practiced in South Africa. Brian is qualified and is working on a full-length book to make that comparison. It's entitled Apartheid South Africa, Apartheid Israel. It's dedicated to those in the occupied Palestinian territories who bear the double pain of apartheid dispossession and much church indifference. Brian reminds us in that book that Mandela said, "We know too well that our freedom is incomplete without the freedom of the Palestinians." I look forward to what Brian has to say, but before he speaks, there will be a word of welcome from the Palestinian ambassador to Ireland, Dr. Gillan Abdel-Majid. After Brian has spoken, Gillian Kingston will moderate a question and answer session, and questions can be posted on the YouTube page in front of you. There will then be a closing comment from Rifat Kassis, who is the General Secretary of Kairos Palestine, and he will be speaking from Bet Sahur in Palestine. So I hand over to you, Gillan, to welcome Brian.
Thank you, John, for this introduction. Actually, today, Minister Reverend Brian Brown is with us today, and he's our guest speaker and the main guest speaker of this event. We wanted to welcome a Methodist minister who came to England as a refugee from apartheid South Africa in 1978, following the regime imposing of banning order. He initially worked in the Denby, Dale, and Clayton West circuit, as you introduced him, near Huddersfield. He then became South Africa for the British Council of Churches during the 1980s before taking up a teaching position at the Kingsmead College in Birmingham, which prepared people for working overseas. With the responsibilities for African affairs, he holds his position in the Methodist World Church office in London. He acted as a consultant to Kairos South Africa when they produced their document that subsequently became a model for Kairos Palestine. He is now retired, but given up interest in the world affairs and how apartheid mindset affects the Holy Land. Let's welcome together Minister Reverend Brian Brown.
Your Excellency, Ambassador Dr. Gillan, thank you for your warmth and welcome, as indeed to you, John, and a delight to see my friend Rifat Kassis on the screen, amongst some others. And I'm delighted to be able to be with the friends who have gathered. I hope come the culmination of our togetherness, you will still view me as of friendly disposition. Certainly, I am engaging in a topic whereby many people would give offense or express it because of the nature of a comparison between apartheid South Africa, which I know from personal experience, and apartheid Israel, of which I know far less, but by virtue of friendship, am on a quick learning curve. And of course, we will refer doubtless later on in the context of this presentation to what is happening in Palestine Jerusalem vicinity at this very time. When I talk of apartheid Israel replicating the policies in large measure of apartheid South Africa, the degree of indignation is because Israel doesn't practice apartheid. Israel is a democratic state and South Africa wasn't. And so what is essential in going down this road of comparison is to get our definitions right, to understand what we're talking about. What was South Africa's apartheid? South Africa's apartheid wasn't a segregation of people, essentially. It wasn't the separation of people into different ethnic groups whereby one was privileged over against another. Not in essence, though that was true. We called that petty apartheid because it was prevalent in many parts of the world. That kind of apartheid that we saw in the United States of America in the so-called Deep South. But what apartheid really was, and we called it Grand Apartheid, was the violent dispossession by one ethnic group of another group of ethnics, ensuring that the non-whites, to use that offensive phrase, were rendered dispossessed through violence of land, of nationality, of freedoms, of equality, and of human rights. And if that definition out of South Africa be allowed, then I say with some confidence that Israel is an apartheid state. If you look at a duck and it quacks like a duck and walks like a duck and swims like a duck, it's a duck. And the duck test is that which I apply to Israel, and I find it replicating South Africa's apartheid. In so saying, there will be some who suggest that is in itself indicative of your anti-Israel, anti-Semitic, anti-Jews, anti-Judaism disposition. Well, I have been graciously introduced as someone who's had a bit of a history of opposing racism, and I haven't given up on that, and I don't deny that anti-Semitism is part of the racism definition, and so I abhor anti-Semitism. I would go on to suggest that I don't deny the Holocaust. In fact, when our kids were growing up, my wife and I took them to the Dachau concentration camp in order to give them, in their tender formative years, some insight as to the nature of fascism, the nature of racism, which is all too prevalent in our world today and which they had lived with in South Africa. And I want to go on to say that as a Christian, though I prefer to call myself a follower of the way, but as that follower of the way, I was acutely aware, still am, of the terrible things we as Christians have done to Jews down the centuries, for which we must be ever penitent and mindful. And yes, finally, I want to say that I don't deny the right of Israel and Israelis to live within its borders in security and in relative peace. What I find disturbing is that I am more inclined to define Israel's borders than are the leaders of Israel. Because suddenly the achievement of a Zionist state is inconsequential. It is neo-Zionism, which is the goal and the achievement to be, bursting beyond its borders, embracing the occupied Palestinian territories of Gaza and West Bank and East Jerusalem. And for some of acute neo-Zionist persuasion, going way beyond into any neighboring state that's up for grabs, be it Lebanon or be it Syria or be it Jordan or be it Sinai, etc. So if that be my argument for not being of anti-Semitic inclination, why is it that the repudiation of Israel as an apartheid society remains so acute? Firstly, I think we have to recognize the nature of the violence that is apartheid violence. Nelson Mandela, an icon of any age, on the occasion of being offered release from jail after 25 of the 27 years he did, declined freedom because his freedom was indivisibly bound up with his people's freedom, and they weren't free. So he wrote to the offerer of this rather questionable freedom, P.W. Botha, apartheid president, a hardliner indeed, and he said, "It is apparent to us blacks and to many whites in South Africa that apartheid is the singular cause of the violence that prevails. If you will cease apartheid violence, violence will end." And what he was saying was that the nature of the relatively limited violence being presented by his African National Congress and its military wing, Umkhonto we Sizwe, that violence wasn't primary violence. It was secondary violence. That violence wasn't initiating violence. It was responsive violence. And of course, he went on in jail for a couple more years because that point was not being conceded. And it wasn't just Botha at that time. In my adopted country, the then Prime Minister in the 1980s was declaring much the same, that Mandela and his terrorist movement were terrorists, incapable of making that distinction between what is primary and what is secondary. And I'm not going to fudge the issue that is taking place at this very moment when we speak, because in addition to the firing of rubber bullets and stink gas and all the rest of it in the streets of Jerusalem and the vicinity of the Al-Aqsa Mosque at this time, perhaps, and certainly within the past hours. In addition to that, Hamas in the occupied, blockaded territory of Gaza is sending rockets into Israel. And I wish to say that I feel that that is wrong. I feel that it is certainly unhelpful in terms of a promotion of the Hamas image. And I also feel that, of course, in militaristic terms, it hasn't got a chance of success. But not condoning, not excusing, just understanding I see it as secondary violence. The news media will tell me tonight that in response to what is happening in Gaza, Israel has acted. Oh, no, that's wrong. It is in response to 50 years of blockade that Gaza has acted. And in a further response, Israel will seek to continue to disappear Palestinians in Gaza and the occupied territories generally. So it is that I found myself in a situation whereby the state media in South Africa was calling me on an occasion to be a terrorist. And because South Africa at that time had a crime of treason as a crime worthy of something awful happening, I had reason for concern. But I think it also gives me now a reason for understanding. The violence then leads to dispossession in apartheid South Africa of land, of nationality, of human rights, of freedoms and equality. Let's look at them quickly and see if we can say like a duck to the Israeli policy as it prevails. In regard to land, isn't it remarkable how mythology can be handed down to perpetuate falsehood? There is the statement that Verwoerd, the architect of South Africa's apartheid, said of the land was bare of blacks when we settler colonial people arrived, though he didn't use that phrase. And of course, the indigenous people of South Africa, be they brown, be they black, had been around a pretty long time, going back into the mists of time and antiquity. Similarly, it is Jewish leaders like Prime Minister Meir, who talked about, not in these precise words, but a land without people, for a people without land. She simply said, more contemptuously, there are no Palestinians. Well, we who are of the Christian faith have done poor service too. It was the Christian Zionist leader, Lord Shaftesbury, who came out with this similar lie. Theodor Herzl, founder of Zionism, used the similar lie. And so we go on lying, and we go on killing. The land which was Palestine 100+ years ago was occupied by 90% Arab Palestinians. It became 40%, 46% to be precise, when the 1948 demarcation took place at the behest of essentially Western superpowers then. And that 46% is currently reduced to about 22%. And suddenly, what was seen as the offer of your part of a two-state solution is now being seen, and let's spell this out carefully, as not an offer anymore. The two-state solution is, as I would suggest, dishonest as the empty state solution or analysis of your. And so it is that here, in terms of land dispossession, we have a people being disappeared. And in South Africa, yes, of course, we had land dispossession. I saw much of it in action, both in colored areas, which is the phrase used for mixed race, or in black areas where Arab or where African people were present. And our ideal, speaking as a white, was to push 80% of the non-white population, an offensive term, of the black population, into 13% of the South African land. And in Israel today, the policy is to disappear Palestine. I would say, I think with integrity, to disappear Palestinians. We were swinish as a white South African in what we did to the black people. But while we moved them through Group Areas Act into the Bantustans, the destitute homelands, the barren places where they were potential labor force workers as white economy required. While we did that to blacks, we didn't disappear them. The ethnic cleansing, the Nakba experience of Palestinians, I regard as a threefold catastrophe. There was the 1947-1948 war, and that catastrophe resulted in what, 720,000 or 800,000 are the estimates, Palestinians being sent out of their homes. And then 1967, the Third Arab-Israel War, and again, Palestinians who were being dispossessed of land. And dare I say, the third Nakba is the one that's the enduring one, the one that doesn't cease. It's happening now as we gather together. There is a catastrophe of land dispossession. A figure of 540 units between East Jerusalem and down the road in Jerusalem. Yeah, only 540 units, you say? Well, the total figure estimated by UN sources in the imminent future is 750,000 illegal settlers in the occupied territory. That's 750,000. They're not going to go home tomorrow, you know, if you ask them nicely. This is the Nakba. And what I don't understand is, given the implausibility, some will say the impossibility of a further state, a Palestinian one arising, which is within reasonably legitimate, acceptable borders, that is still being trotted out by the superpowers, by my government, as something that will be threatened if we go on with this nasty encounters in and around Al-Aqsa Square. So stop it, Israel, or the chances of peace will be diminished. It is the occupation that needs to end, just as apartheid needed to end for peace to prevail. Because as we learned in South Africa, the pursuit of peace is a nonsense. The pursuit of justice has the fruit of delivering peace. And that is the goal, which, speaking as a religious guy, is the divine expectation. And then we can talk about figures and deliberate whether it is true that all these people have been dispossessed of their land. But no, it's the Jewish new revisionist historians like Pape and like Morris and Avi Schaim, who tell it as it is, as Jews, commendably telling their fellow Jews, this is what we have done. This is not some person in Britain propounding propaganda. This is the academic voice of Jews, declaring with something of penitence, thank God, that this is how we replicate apartheid South Africa. And then moving on into the denial of nationality between the Mediterranean Sea and the River Jordan. There is not one Palestinian who has a vote to be exercised in which he votes or she votes as a national of the country or of a country that is a nation. I'm not going to develop that. I leave it as a bold statement, but I leave it as an irrefutable truth. And so when it then comes to people saying, but Israel is a democracy, I want to suggest that the democratic state of Israel is a Jewish state for Arabs, and it is a democratic state for Jews. But that doesn't make it a democracy, it makes it an ethnocracy. And so to suggest that since at least the nation-state law of the Knesset, the Israeli parliament, was passed 3 or 4 years ago, since then, when Israel has self-defined itself as a nation-state for Jews, and for Jews wherever they may be, but not a nation-state for Arab Israelis, since it said that, any pretense at being democracy is a folly and ought to be called such. It is a nation state for Jews only. South Africa was a nation state for whites only. Only whites were nationals of South Africa. Blacks were nationals of Bantustan's homelands. They might not ever have been there, but never mind. They weren't, of course, born there, but never mind. We will call them what we call them. That is conducive to our own prejudices and our desired demographic superiority. And so there is the replication in very, very precise terms, the denial of nationality. And so Arab Israelis are citizens of the state in a torturous way that I had to spend some time getting my mind around. East Palestinians who are in the supposedly 1980 annexed territory, annexed by Israel, they are, as an annexed people, obviously then not citizens anymore, they are called immigrants by Israel of an alien nature, temporary sojourners. All right, they have citizenship in the state of Israel, which they've never seen, but it's not a citizenship that embraces the vote, but it's citizenship. And so we move into this deluded world of using definition to hide dispossession. Dispossession through violence, dispossession of nationality, dispossession of land, dispossession of human rights. Time will not allow me to go into the 35 instances of dispossession of human rights that I deal with in this book, nearing completion. But certainly, in looking at the human rights issue, have made, as some of you will have made, this exciting discovery that suddenly coming at the aspect of comparing Israel, apartheid, South Africa, apartheid, we find that the comparative analysis is now being complemented by the legal analysis. And the legal analysis is gaining by leaps and bounds. It wasn't terribly long ago that a United Nations Commission, which was rubbished by the United Nations at the behest of a Trump administration. But never mind, Trump has gone, perhaps forever. What has happened is that the United Nations Commission defined how Israel, in the 4 domains of its control of Palestinians, the domain of occupied territories, the domain of Israel itself, the domain of the diaspora, the refugees in the vicinity, particularly in those domains, and the domain of East Jerusalem, in the 4 of them, Israel was exercising total domination. Israel was exercising apartheid, because the essence of the international law, which was being violated by Israel, is found in the following categories. The 4th Geneva Convention of 1947, with its particular Article 49, and then the United Nations Declaration, International Declaration about apartheid and its crime against humanity, and then the Rome Statute of 2002 with its implementation of the International Criminal Court, and then the United Nations resolutions, one after the other, be they Security Council, be they General Assembly. The cumulative impact of the crime of humanity, the Rome Statute, the Geneva Conventions, and now we are seeing that the human rights world is saying, yes, this is a very helpful analysis. And so one of the reasons why my book keeps on getting set aside for more inclusion, and is becoming a bit of a tome, is that there are these constant interventions, be it Yesh Din, the Israeli human rights body saying, yeah, in the occupied territories, Israel practices apartheid. Probably, it goes on to say in heavy black type in its report, probably Israel itself is apartheid. We've got to look at that. And then along comes the B'Tselem body, the biggest human rights body in Israel. This is not a Palestinian voice. They would say these things, wouldn't they? This is the Israeli human rights body saying Israel is an apartheid society. And then along comes, of all things, Human Rights Watch just a few weeks ago, which was established in some measure by Jews, which has had a very softly approach to the Palestinian problem, which is really an Israeli problem, and has said, not only is Israel practicing apartheid, but the crime of apartheid is being evidenced. And if the crime of apartheid is being evidenced, then the International Criminal Court has rightly decided, as it did a few weeks ago, to investigate the war crimes of Israel, being perpetuated incidentally as we speak. And the sanctions against the war crime perpetrators need to be considered in court procedures. Immediately, my British government has said, rubbish, but never mind. We must, I think, come to an end. What I have tried to say is that my initial inclination was to write a book replicating apartheid, South Africa's policies, and Israel. Two other factors have intruded in the interim. Rifat, who will be with us shortly in discussion, he has, with his colleague, the former patriarch in Palestine, sent around this cry for hope. And he sent it around to the ecumenical family, that is the body of Christian believers and churches around the world, asking for a response to their dispossession, to their disappearance, to their discrimination, to their constancy of imposed violence and dispossession of land and nationality and rights and equality. And there is, because we are, as Christian churches by and large, so beholden to not upsetting our Jewish neighbor and our Jewish friends, and so beholden to the sins that we historically have perpetrated towards Jews, and that's true, and God forgive us. But we are so beholden to that history that to Rifat we say, don't call us, we'll call you. If we do identify with you, if we do grasp the nettle of saying this is wrong, then interfaith dialogue between Christians and Jews will be negated. And that is our priority, dealing with history, not dealing with the reality that's being played out in the streets of Jerusalem now. Besides, dealing with history is easier than the reality of intruding upon the violence of the moment. And so Rifat allowed me to feel, let the cry for hope be disseminated as much as I, in my pitiful way, can do. And the second thing was, and I hesitate to say this, because I don't believe in election. I don't believe in ethnicity. I don't believe in exclusivity. I don't believe in exceptionalism. I don't believe in entitlement. And all those things the apartheid government and its conniving church believed in my South Africa, to the detriment of blacks and a couple of whites thrown in. And it is the 5 big E's that are now sacrosanct in our dialogue, our interfaith discussion. Don't question election, ethnicity, exceptionalism, entitlement, etc. And the living stones, as the New Testament puts it, the people like Rifat, who've been hanging about in their Palestine since the mists of time, they are the disappearing stones, as well as the ones who are stoned when they are prophetic, when they are liberating, when they are Kairos people, taking the moment in its urgency to declare the justice of God, which is all determinative for religious authenticity. And I'm told by Munta Isak, who did the last of your webinars, that Christian community, 1922, 11%, coexisting very happily with the overwhelming Muslim majority. Today, less than 1%. And yeah, this is beating the church drum, and I shouldn't. But that worries me, as it worries Muslim compatriots, I'm sure, because in their togetherness, they are being disappeared. And I am jealous of that togetherness. And if in one of the questions I be asked, but surely it's the Muslims that are making the Christians flee. In a recent poll taken, we are assured that 8 out of 10 Christians say they are most anxious, most fearful, most disempowered by the settler community and the way a new violence is being perpetrated. Not essentially of the military, but of the settler community. Some of them, of course, I can't generalize, but enough of them to make the already hellish plight of Palestinians double the plight, because your illegal neighbor with the flag of Israel flying triumphantly is your new enemy, even though you seek to love your enemy, as the Kairos Palestine document from Rifat and others tells us time and time again, and for me so constantly that I'm inclined to say, oh, shut up, man. all this calling for loving, you ask for the impossible. But as a follower of the way, I have to retract my attempt to silence and seek to emulate that Palestinian voice. Thanks be to God. Amen.
Brian, thank you very much for a most challenging and sobering presentation, which raises many questions in our minds and in our hearts. You will know of the great Irish statesman Edmund Burke, who once said, "All that is required for evil to prevail is that good people say nothing." So thank you. You have done your utmost to ensure that evil does not prevail, and our prayer is that we have the courage and the tenacity to do exactly the same. There are some questions for you, some questions perhaps of a practical nature. You have drawn the comparison between the apartheid regime in South Africa and apartheid in Palestine. What were the factors, do you think, that brought the South African Nationalist Party to negotiations to end apartheid?
Thank you, and thank you to the questioner. The time that I lived in South Africa was not just a fraught time, it was a pretty hopeless time. Yeah, I was only in my mid-30s, and I didn't believe that in my lifetime, even if I enjoyed longevity, that I would ever see apartheid end. Now, that's an honest statement. I couldn't see it ending. And then two things started to come together. One was the emergence of a movement of people. It was called Black Consciousness, which brought together those who were, if you like, being occupied, and brought them together in a way that was beyond tribal ethnicity. And the essence of Black consciousness was, it is our oppression that unites us, even more than skin pigmentation. That movement of the people is always an imperative. And I do not for a minute diminish the commitment and the pain and the struggle of the people of Palestine to come together and throw off their chains. But I simply present it as the prior voice that needs to be heard, because no white liberal in South Africa was going to, with all his protestations of solidarity, get rid of apartheid. The second factor was that at last the penny began to drop within the international community, that apartheid wasn't segregation, awful, separating people. Apartheid wasn't about blacks wanting to sit on white park benches. Apartheid was about Grand Apartheid, the ending of violent dispossession. And that penny began to drop. And as that penny began to drop, so a reaction to be participant in the ending of apartheid was, amongst other things, boycott, divestment. I'm getting mixed up between the American divestment and our divestment, and boycott, BDS. And that BDS became so powerful, particularly in financial terms in the end, that self-interest became a factor for moving away from apartheid. We whites, if I can put myself into that white category, who had our posterior in the butter all that time of apartheid, suddenly found ourselves being somewhat disadvantaged. And suddenly we were needing to get rid of BDS, boycott, divestment, huge capital flows out of South Africa, no fresh investment, and sanctions. We needed to get rid of it, not for their sake, but for our sake. And we're coming back to what Mandela believed in and what I, as his disciple, believe in, the indivisibility of freedom. Hey, man, we can't be free as long as these blacks ain't free. And so it was a people's struggle. It was a bending the ear of the international community to understand the righteousness and the justice of the oppressed people's cause. It was, intruding another voice, the voice of a church that, however belatedly, began to say, hey man, we are part of the problem and we should be part of the answer. We are offering a state theology which says an apartheid state is a gift of God to our detriment. Let's move into a Kairos theology, which is justice-based. And then these factors coming together. Plus, I have to say, we had a Tutu, a Mandela, a Tambo, before them a Lutuli. We had giants. But the giants who had been dwarfed by the international community took a long time to be heard.
And there's a corollary to that question, Brian. What do you think might bring Israeli political leaders seriously to engage with Palestinians now? Can you extrapolate from the South African history into the current situation in Israel and the occupied Palestinian territories?
The obvious answer for me, which I've hinted at, is a sense of self-interest. You know, what is happening in Palestine today is horrendous for Palestinians. It's also horrendous for Jews. We don't want to see Jewish police and Jewish soldiers under siege or attack. Yes, the imbalance in all that is equally horrendous. For every Israeli killed, 24 Palestinians are killed. But I don't want to put one Israeli life above a Palestinian life or the other way around. There is equality of life and humanity and worth and dignity between Israeli and Palestinian. But what I am saying is that while we abhor what is going on, it is the knowledge that the only way we will attain peace is when there is the invisibility of justice which will confer peace. And so there is a degree of the self-perpetration, self-pursuance, which could concentrate the mind. But the other thing surely is this, and that is the moral thing. Sounds as if I'm just trying to be plausible, but I could honestly not understand in South African apartheid era how we whites were so hesitant to speak up and against that which we intrinsically knew to be wrong and to be evil and to be against our religious beliefs, be they Jewish, be they Muslim, be they Christian. And so it is that forthrightness which is an imperative. And can I just quote Desmond Tutu on this? Because even if I never say another word, I'd like to go out with this swan song. Tutu says, people are scared to say wrong is wrong because the Jewish lobby is powerful, very powerful. Well, for goodness sake, this is God's world, and we live in a moral universe. The apartheid government was very powerful. Injustice and oppression will never prevail. Those who are powerful have to remember the litmus test that God gives the powerful. What is your treatment of the poor, the hungry, the voiceless? And on the basis of that, God passes judgment. So my appeal to the religious community is, what is your treatment of the poor, the hungry, and the powerless? On the strength of that, God judges us. And on the strength of that, God blesses us.
Now, can I draw you forward a bit to your time when you were Africa Secretary of the then British Council of Churches? Can you suggest from that experience fruitful ways, good ways of engaging with, the likes of diplomats and civil servants and government ministries on the issues of justice for Palestine? This is a question which applies to us here in Ireland, not least as our government has a seat on the Security Council at the moment. How can we best, as a people and as a government, engage with them?
Yes, I mean, thinking for a start of the church community, because that is something most readily addressed, whether the Johnson government in, almost inclined to say England these days, but in United Kingdom, whether that Johnson government would be receptive to receiving the Palestinian voice is questionable. What is an imperative for me is that the church community at top hierarchical level ask the Palestinian Christian leadership. And remember, there were all 13 of the Palestinian indigenous churches who signed the Kairos Palestine document and asked for creative responses by the churches in Britain and Ireland 10 years ago, for which they are still awaiting an answer. And so I would ask our bishops and our archbishops and our moderators and our presidents to, as a cohesive body of Christian concern, to say, we want to hear you, we want to listen, we want to learn. As I was constantly saying in South Africa, those who got it right weren't smarter than those who got it wrong, vis-a-vis Mandela, vis-a-vis BDS, vis-a-vis liberation. They were just better listeners. They were more humble. They said, man, if it's so bad, come and tell us. But what they do is, don't call us, we'll call you. But we're very busy at the moment in the cordiality of interfaith dialogue that doesn't intrude on justice.
Yes, it has been sometimes said that there's a sort of a subtle ecumenical exchange going around. If you don't talk to us about our responsibility for the Holocaust, we won't talk to you about how you're treating the Palestinians.
And what do you think about blackmail?
A question has come in about Oslo, Brian. Does Brian think that Palestinians are also chained by Oslo? And should those chains be broken once and for all?
In the history being played out at the moment about the COVID virus and the tragedy, pandemic, we see that Israel, commendably, brilliantly, has had a rollout of the vaccine, and good for Israel, and may the people be blessed as a consequence. Their neighbor in occupied Palestinian territory has fared less well, far less well. And a debate has taken place. On the one side, there is the suggestion that the Oslo Accords have handed over to the Palestinian Authority the responsibilities that are theirs. And so Israel is exempt from having any responsibility over and above a moral sense of being neighbor and wishing to be kind. But the Oslo Accords make it your baby, occupied Palestine. Whereas other voices have come forward to say, well, actually, in terms of international law, in terms of articles in the 40s, 49 and others, of the Fourth Geneva Convention and so on, these take priority in international law, and the people of that ilk tell me that this is so. And so it is the responsibility of Israel to meet the crisis, the huge crisis of pandemic coming through Gaza, West Bank today. And why have I said this? I've said that because as I understand the Oslo Accords, and I am not competent to go into the Oslo Accords with any authoritative response, but as I understand it, it was in the end, like this moment today, the Oslo Accords not for Palestinians reaping great benefit, I think that's a very moderate way of putting it, but of handing over responsibility in a pseudo-responsible way, whereas you are completely, as the Israeli state, dominating the area A, B, and C of the West Bank, of Gaza completely dominating by blockade, as we see it happening this minute, and completely dominating Palestinians in East Jerusalem. So what we see is great benefits for Israel and fewer benefits for Palestinians in the Oslo Accords. And when I'm led to understand that those 1990 days were to culminate in their fulfillment of the Accords within the space of, say, 5 years, and here we are down the road into 25 years, I say, did they really benefit? And that is a Palestinian answer, but I have anxieties.
Thank you. And Brian, what must probably be the last question, a number of people fear to criticize the state of Israel because they suspect that they will be accused of anti-Semitism. And this is something I think which Netanyahu encourages. You know, if you criticize Israel, then you're being anti-Semitic. How do you respond to that fear?
In South Africa, I was anti-white, I was traitorous, I was treacherous, and there's a few other things, and this is a nice, pleasant gathering, and we won't intrude those. But in South Africa, there were these pejorative, derogatory things being said. What I say in response now is that the Palestinians, I've lost the train. Bad moment. What I'm trying to say is, give me the question.
The question is, how do you respond to people who fear to criticize the state of Israel because they think they will be accused of anti-Semitism?
Exactly what you said, and the silly old man became what I say is, I am into pro-Palestinianism. And I would be, wouldn't I? If I'm a follower of the way, I've just read Tutu to you, I could read the Bible too. In fact, I could quote Jesus at length. My identity now goes beyond ethnicity. Right. And so I want to be all things to all people. I want to be pro-Palestinian because they are of the oppressed in the context of this discussion. And that's where Jesus says I should be as my primary solidarity engagement. But does that make me anti-Semitic? Good heavens, if I am pro a people in their oppression, does this mean I am hateful of the oppressor? Good heavens, Mandela was very pro-Black people and their liberation. He wasn't hateful of white people. The writers of Cry for Hope, the Palestinian cry of recent days, 1st July last year, they are not anti-Semitic. As I said in my paper, they are very pro-loving Jewish people. They're not anti-Judaism. And so I decline to have somebody like Netanyahu saying, if I am one thing, then I have to be another.
Thank you very much indeed, Brian. Earlier today, we received a message of greeting from the Methodist Liaison Office in Jerusalem. And they finished by saying, we pray that you will be enlightened by Brian's presentation and that you will feel compelled to take appropriate action. We have indeed been enlightened by your presentation and by your response to these questions and by yourself, Brian. And I hope that we will indeed be compelled to take what is the appropriate action. Thank you so very much indeed. And now I want to hand over to Rifat Kassis, who is the General Secretary of Kairos, Palestine, and also a founder of Children's Rights International. Rifat.
Thank you. Thank you, Gillian. Thank you, Brian, for this, as usual, for this powerful and brilliant presentation. Actually, on Sunday, the 11th of February, 1990, around midday, I was summoned to meet my Israeli Jewish progressive lawyer at that time, Tamar Belig. At that time, I was a political prisoner, detained administratively in an Israeli concentration prison called Katziot in Negev Desert. Administrative detainee means imprisonment without trial or charge, and evidence is not disclosed. After inquiring about my situation in prison, among other issues, and just before she left the hall where we met, she turned back to me and told me, Rifat, to cheer you up, Mandela was released today from his prison. She said it swiftly and quickly, without any introduction and without expecting an answer from me. She left me, although speechless, but with an overwhelming feeling of joy and happiness, which was equal to the same feeling I had when my first baby girl was born. The Israeli warden took me back to the ward, and the first thing I told my fellow prisoners was, comrades, apartheid is over, Palestine next. The entire prison entered into a state of joy, which cannot be explained or even justified, especially that almost none of us prisoners, including me, knew enough about South Africa and its struggle. However, we knew Mandela, And just like Arafat, he was an icon for the Palestinians. At that time, I have never had the opportunity to meet any person from South Africa. It was 5 years later that I had met the first South African person. And it took me another 5 years to take one as a friend. And early 2008, I managed to visit South Africa for the first time in my life. In this visit, I discovered how much we were living in similar situations and how deeply we were connected in both spirit and struggle. In that visit, I had the pleasure to meeting you, Brian, when I informed you and the hosting group about our work on drafting the Palestinian Kairos document, which was launched 1 year after in 2009. It remains shocking to understand how many of our South African friends who had visited Palestine informed us that apartheid in Palestine is far worse than the apartheid they have experienced. I started to understand and appreciate the historical roots of these commonalities and differences to realize why Israeli apartheid is of a special type and why it has been more difficult to overcome and defeat. The Palestinian Nakba and South African apartheid started in the same year, namely 1948. Madrid Conference of 1991, which was supposed to be the peace conference sponsored or co-sponsored by the USA and the Soviet Union at that time, happened 1 year after Mandela got released. Oslo Accords, which were supposed to be the starting mile of our walk to freedom, happened in 1993, 1 year before the first democratic elections, the official declaration of ending the apartheid in South Africa. 2 years after South African elections, the Palestinians in 1996 conducted their first democratic elections. Fortunately, South Africa got liberated, but unfortunately, the freedom of the Palestinians is still hindered by indirect and invisible strengthened occupation and apartheid. Apartheid South Africa and apartheid Israel have strong similarities and bonds between them, be they in policies or practices, and in both treatment and violations. We sometimes spend more time trying to show these similarities, while in fact, and this is what we were talking about, Brian, if you remember when we were in Ireland 2 years back. In fact, we need to spend the time on showing the similarities between the powers who supported both the South African apartheid and are supporting the Israeli one till today. It is stunning to know that the same powers who sided with the apartheid are supporting our suffering today. Same countries, same churches who stood next to the apartheid South Africa are the same ones who are standing alongside the Israeli apartheid. Your book, Brian's, came out at the suitable time. As you wrote about your intention in writing the book, and I quote, is that the comparison reminds us that the fires of the South African apartheid struggle burn as fiercely in today's Palestine. And I end the quote. For me, the importance of your book, Brian, is that it brings back and reminds us of this special bond between South Africa and Palestine. This bond, which to a large extent was shaking in the past years, especially on the official front. When Mandela said, and when you said it also in your presentation, we will not be free until the Palestinians are free, and our freedom is incomplete without the freedom of the Palestinians, he was not joking. Actually, he made these comments when he was the chair of the ANC and also when he became the president of South Africa. Your book comes to remind South Africans that they cannot and shouldn't follow the example of some countries who left the Palestinians alone, or the Arab states who are running to normalize with Israel. Yes, South Africans need to be Catholic more than the Pope. You need to be Catholic more than the Pope, as they were the ones who knew the meaning of oppression and the meaning of solidarity with the oppressed. South Africa should challenge and champion the way Israel treating the Palestinians on the global level. South Africa should not fail us. Your book is neither solely theological nor political, but both. Written in a nice style, full with documented facts and opinions. This book is a must-read for South Africans and Palestinians alike in order to renew their bond. It is a reminder that Palestine is still fighting for its freedom. Talking about apartheid comes in the right moment. As you said, Brian, where Israel is being labeled as an apartheid country by many. You brought nicely the discussion and the questioning of some people on how much it is useful using the word apartheid in the Palestinian context, as you wrote, and I quote, some might question whether an analysis of Israel as an apartheid state at this point of time is helpful. Would a more helpful description of Israeli policy be that a settler colonial project? Now, of course, you confirm in your elaboration that Israel is an apartheid state. Your confirmation comes from theological perspectives, which will add a lot to the current discussion about the Israeli apartheid led by reputed human rights groups and defenders, which you mentioned them, Yesh Din, B'Tselem, Richard Falk, Virginia Tilley, many, even Carter, he said that Israel is an apartheid. I hope and pray that your book will find its way to the churches and ecumenical bodies to read it and study it. You're writing about equating, criticizing Zionism and Israel with anti-Semitism, and as you answered this question, comes also at the right time and right moment where many are challenging the International Holocaust Remembrance Alliance, the IHRA definition of anti-Semitism. Among them, the Jerusalem Declaration Initiative on Anti-Semitism. And I quote you, just as the criticism of Black South African to the apartheid regime was not motivated by anti-white sentiment, exactly what you said now, criticism of Israel that follow are not motivated by anti-Semitic sentiments. Finally, you start your book talking about the Palestinian cry for hope and emphasizing the linkages with South Africa. And I think you bluntly criticize the global church for its deficits and hesitance in being a real solidarity and jointly struggle with the Palestinians. And I quote you again, this analogy with apartheid, South Africa, as seen in Cry for Hope, is important in recalling how Christian bodies and churches committed themselves to the ending of apartheid injustice in the past and in revealing how they might respond to a similar injustice today practiced in Palestine. Now in Palestine, we have reached the moment of truth. Thus, we must speak the truth. We no longer have the silence of the international community, and that includes churches. Silence means complicity with the crime. Your book comes to strengthen the foundation of justice and to strengthen the solidarity among those working to achieve it. For all of this, I heartedly welcome your book, Brian. The founder of apartheid Israel and its first prime minister, David Ben-Gurion, said in 1948, we must do everything to ensure that the Palestinians will never come back to their homes. And he added, the old will die and the young will forget. 73 years after his shameless declaration, Young Palestinians have not forgotten, contrary to what he had hoped. And the proof is what the young Jerusalemites in Sheikh Jarrah neighborhood are doing today, and how their counterparts throughout historic Palestine are answering their call. Thank you again, Brian, for taking the time and the initiative to write this book. And I am looking forward to read it. I'm looking forward also to participate in distributing it. And thank you, Kairos Island, for inviting me for this important webinar. And thank you.
Thank you for those comments, Rifat, eloquent as always. I will be giving a book to the ambassador when it comes out. Brian, you'd better get on and finish it. You can't keep adding to it forever. Thank you to everyone who has shared with us in this afternoon's talk. And please, if people would like to be added to our mailing list in Kairos Palestine, I think the details have been on your YouTube screen. It's kairospalestine.org is the webpage, and kairospalestine@gmail.com for the email. So it just remains for me to thank Brian especially for his contribution. Thank you to the ambassador, Dr. Jilan Abdelmajid, to Rifat Karsis, and to Gillian Kingston. So thanks, and we hopefully continue now to act on what we have heard and stand alongside the people who are suffering intensely at this particular moment as we meet. So thank you, everyone.
Thank you. Bye-bye.